Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm McKenna from Murder by the Book in Houston, Texas, and I'm excited tonight to be joined by Joseph Kanon and his editor, Colin Harrison, who is also a crime writer. We've all been longtime fans of Mr. Kanon's at Murder by the Book for years, so this will be a treat. He's here tonight to talk about the Berlin Exchange, his brand new release. And I'm going to go ahead and get this show on the road. Let me go ahead and bring him on to introduce him. Hi, how are you this evening?
Never better. Good to be with you.
Excellent. I'm sorry, I have a loud cat screaming at me right now, trying to get the attention away from the event, but she will be quiet. Joseph Kanon is the Edgar Award winning author of The Accomplice, Defectors, Leaving Berlin, Istanbul Passage, The Prodigal Spy, Alibi, Stardust, and The Good German, which was made into a major motion picture starring George Clooney and Cate Blanchett. He lives in New York City. And like I said, he's here tonight to talk about his new novel, The Berlin Exchange. For those of you watching, if you are so inclined, I've put a link in the comments for you to order books. You can also read more about both authors and their other books at that link. And if you have questions, we will get to those later on in the event, but don't be shy. I will be back on in about 30 or 45 minutes to moderate questions. So you have a little while to think about them and put them in the live chat on YouTube or in the comments on Facebook. And we also have a special guest tonight, Colin Harrison. Hi, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
Thank you for being here tonight and for leading this discussion. I'll do your bio as well really quickly. Colin Harrison is vice president and editor-in-chief at Scribner. Some of his recent Scribner books include The Mueller Report by the Washington Post, Light Perpetual, and Golden Hill by Francis Spufford, The Garden Gate by Daniel Okrent, The Red Sparrow series by Jason Matthews, The Short and Tragic Life of Robert Peace by Jeff Hobbs, winner of the LA Times Book Prize, Rebel Yell and Empire of the Summer Moon, finalists for the Pulitzer Prize by S.C. Gwynne, The Emerald Mile by Kevin Fedarko, and selected past books include Nixonland by Rick Perlstein, Inside of a Dog by Alexandra Horowitz, Horse Soldiers by Doug Stanton, and Jarhead by Anthony Swofford. So quite the illustrious list there. I'm going to go away. I'm going to leave you two to talk, and I will be back on in 35 or 40 minutes with those audience questions. Have fun.
Thank you.
Well, Colin, now that I've heard the list, when did you get the time to edit me? This is wonderful.
You don't require any editing, Joe. You know that.
Everyone requires it. So this is completely unrehearsed. So it can be an inquisition. You can ask all the questions you might have asked while you were editing the book.
I'm going to ask those questions, and I hope maybe even some other ones too that I hadn't thought of. So look, let's start talking about this book. The Berlin Exchange is a lot of things. It's a Swiss clock of a plot that's very thrilling and absolutely unpredictable. I'm very good at figuring out the endings of books before we get to the ending, and I could not possibly have figured out the ending of this book. It's put together beautifully. It's also a meditation on the mysteries and secrets in a marriage. It's also a love letter to a time and a place, Berlin, during its mysterious 1960s Cold War incarnation. And I almost said the word incantation, which is really about what you did. You have summoned this city and this time, and I think that's maybe a good place to start, to ask you, why did you choose to go back to Berlin as a setting up for your novel, and what is it about Berlin in this period that beckons you so strongly?
Well, as you know better than anyone, I mean, all of my books begin with place. It's what drives it. It's what usually inspires the origin idea to get the whole thing off the ground. It's always to explore a place more. And Berlin, I don't know, for me is the gift that keeps on giving, or at least the location that keeps on giving. This is the third book I've done that's set in Berlin. The first, The Good German, was the immediate after effects of World War II, the Allied occupation, 1945. The second in leaving Berlin was the Berlin airlift, at the time when the Cold War was truly ripping the city and dividing it in two, and the intellectual emigres who had gone into exile during Hitler had returned. So you also had an ideological sort of warfare. I could have left it there, except I kept going back to Berlin because I love Berlin. And I kept wanting to know more and more about East Germany and East Berlin. We now, it's a failed state, and sometimes the figure of fun, of humor, the DDR museum, which commemorates it, is awash in a kind of false nostalgie, they call it. And yet it wasn't a joke. I mean, it affected the lives of millions and millions of people. It was a kind of ideological test case for things. And consequently, it deserves some serious attention, or at least it deserved it from me because I hadn't known enough. And what I discovered, of course, was an absolutely fascinating society. Why Berlin in the 60s? Because it becomes the epicenter for all of the ideological struggles in the second part of the century. I mean, Berlin itself is the headquarters for fascism. It then becomes ground zero for the Cold War. And it was particularly interesting because I know we talked about this when we were actually working on the book together. One of the aspects about the Cold War that interests me is that the soldiers involved were, in fact, the intelligence agencies. They were really at war with each other, and often not to discover an actual secret, but just to discover who each other were. Who is this mole that's destroying from within, etc. This becomes the great drama of that period, and it's alive and well in Berlin, where practically everybody's a spy until the wall goes up. So it's now the third book, but it's my wall book. This is the one that has Berlin with the wall going right through it.
And I know that you went to Berlin, you walked the streets, you summoned the story from your experience. I'm wondering if you can just unpack that a little bit, unpack the understanding of a novelist walking the streets, going to places intentionally, but also not intentionally, spontaneously, looking at shadows, looking at cobblestones, looking at street lamps, looking at trees and benches. What is that process, that fugue state that in which you are summoning the book and you are suggestible to yourself? How does that work?
Well, that's an accurate description of it. I mean, the fugue state. I describe it as location scouting for this movie that you're about to shoot in your own mind, in your head. And one of the things that becomes fascinating about a city like Berlin, so much of which is rebuilt, is that you have to not only take in like a sponge everything that you're seeing around you, but you have to reimagine it 20, 30, or 40 years before, when what you're actually seeing now may not have existed. You have to check it with photographs. You have to go and look at old maps. You have to go around. But what you want to discover, I think anyway, aside from a real feel for the city, is where would your characters live? I mean, what kind of apartment could you afford? Would you walk to work? Were there trams? What were the hot restaurants that people wanted to get into? Where would you be seen, etc.? Now, none of this may necessarily appear in the book, and it may not become relevant, but it's relevant to you to have a feel for what the characters were seeing. I mean, if he's walking down the street, the reader only has to see one or two details, but you, if you're writing it, have to see all of them. I think, anyway. I mean, you've written and you've had the same experience. There's also this quality of being alone by yourself, so that you really are almost invisible in the streets, and you can imagine these people there. I had made several of these trips without my wife, and then she came with me after we had, I'd written one of the books already. And we were walking around, and I said, well, that's where Lena's flat was, and that's where so-and-so was, and this is that. And she said, you know an awful lot of people in Berlin, but they're all in your head.
Well, were there any moments where you were in your invisible observing mode, sort of almost a literary spy, as it were, where you saw somebody do something, uh, a woman touch her dress, a man adjust his hat, someone step off the curb, where or where the book reached itself out of the landscape and found you. Does that kind of magic happen? Do you remember moments like that?
Yes and no. I mean, I don't know that there's especially an aha moment, at least one that fuels the plot. I tend to make things up as I go along. So this Swiss clock plot that you're talking about, I didn't know it when I started it out. You just have to make it up. But there was a moment that I remember that a lot of things click into place, and you see something you hadn't seen before. And what's this really about? I wanted to write about East Germany, East Berlin. I wanted my protagonist, who's a spy who's been traded and has been traded east, so that for him this actually represents freedom from prison rather than the reverse for thousands and thousands of East Berliners who are trying to get out. He's happy to go back. But what we have in mind about this culture all the time is this gray, unremitting surveillance state, this repressive authoritarian regime, all of which is true. I mean, I wouldn't sugarcoat that at all. But there was a moment when I was walking along what is now Karl Marx Alley, but had begun as Stalin Alley, and is a kind of showcase boulevard in East Berlin and had been a showcase for that regime. It's now almost laughable in its datedness. It looks, like Soviet Baroque functional. It's just, Stalin wedding cake style building. You take one look at it and you know instantly that you're in the Eastern sphere and under the sway of that sort of cultural thing. But as you walk along, what began to occur to me, that I began to see for the first time, was how aspirational this street was. And you think, this wasn't always just a gray prison. There was a time when people thought they were doing something wonderful here, or wanted something to happen ideologically, that they'd invested in it. And I came across one of the apartment buildings that is set back from Karl Marx Alley itself, is a kind of very handsome, almost Art Deco high-rise apartment building. And in the lobby, there were photographs of its opening. And it was like a movie premiere. And I thought, for people who had just come out of the state of living in rubble, living in absolutely devastated city conditions, and it was still all around them. I mean, the East, there was so much less money to fix things up that, unlike West Berlin, which became a showcase for capitalism, East Berlin was for a very long time still in ruins. And all of a sudden, here these people are at this really very handsome and to them glamorous and brand new building, and it represents some kind of future out of this rubble that I think we don't think about when we see it now. We see it and say, oh, what a failed society this was. It failed its own citizens. It failed its own ideology. Or maybe the ideology was doomed to fail. It's really hard to parse that. Anyway, I had that sort of moment seeing it. But, as long as you talk about how do things start, they don't end up necessarily where you think they're going to end up. I mean, one of the origins for this book is that it turns out that I have a friend, a German friend, who was a child actor in the DDR in East Germany at the time. And I hadn't known this at first. And when this came out, I was absolutely fascinated. I thought, what was that like? You don't think about East Germany as having a film culture. You don't think of it as a kind of, Hollywood place. But it turns out that in the luck of the occupation lottery, the equivalent of Hollywood, the UFA studios out at Babelsberg, fell into the Soviet occupation zone. And so they, in fact, inherited what would be all the sound stages and back lots and everything like that. And if not vibrant, there was an extremely lively film industry going on. And I thought, I don't know about this. So off I go to the Lincoln Center Performing Arts Library and to study this. And I came across a book which was essentially a casting book of headshots of actors at the time in 1963, when the book is set. And there they all were, trying to look like Maria Schell or Maximilian Schell. And it was almost this flip side of the Europe that we knew at that point, completely invisible to us. I mean, nobody had ever seen it. Now, it turns out that I have a character in the book who is a child and a child actor, but he's not the focus of the book. And it's not what the book turned out to be about. It turned out to be about espionage, which was even more popular than film in East Germany. But it's funny how things start and how they don't necessarily go down the straight path that you expect for them.
Let's talk about the parents of that child actor in the book. Um, his mother is East German. His father is American, and their relationship as young lovers is discovered only in by way of memory. But one gets the sense that their relationship is even in the past is the central hot cell of the entire story, around which an enormous amount of intrigue accumulated. And for people who like their espionage mixed in with the affairs of the heart, this is the most delicious possible combination. And I'm curious how this came to you and how you thought of it, and how did you imagine the young woman who the American fell in love with, and whether she fell in love with him is a little bit mysterious to me. There was a lot of lust involved, and I'd love to hear you talk about that.
I think she's in love with him.
Okay.
I think the situation mirrored, I guess, was suggested by, it has often been thought that Kim Philby originally was turned by a woman that he fell in love with in Vienna, and that she was, in a sense, she wasn't his recruiter, but she was certainly the impetus for him to get involved in that world of espionage. I have a line in the book where he is thinking to himself, could it just have been about lust, as you say? I mean, could I have really been that stupid? Because we are talking about a couple, both of whom participated in this espionage, but only one of whom was caught, him. And consequently, we have a tremendous complicated guilt on her end, a sense of trying to put things right, a sense of atonement, et cetera, et cetera. But the line that I think expresses their relationship is that he said, I didn't do it for her, but I never would have done it alone. So she's part and parcel of everything that he had done that completely changed his life and took it over and broke it in two. It's, that sort of treachery is something that's not easily recoverable from. Consequently, when he returns after 10 years, she has remarried. Everything now is about the child, and there's a kind of almost kabuki dance they have to play with each other to try and figure out how they really feel about each other now. And how they feel, I think, is that he's, as always, completely infatuated with her, but not stupid, and realizes that, in fact, she has been, to some extent, the cause of all of the dismay in his life, but also a lot of the joy. It's, as they say in that, what was that movie title? It's complicated. And I think often these relationships are complicated, but they're really complicated if you're a spy, because then leading this life of a lie, if the two of you are leading it together, but only one of you pays for it, it puts, as they say, a strain on the marriage.
Well, your rendering of their relationship is very deft, and there are enormous moments of importance that hang just on a word or a phrase or a look between them. And the reader of the book really just can't help but be completely compelled to want to know what's going to happen to the two of them. And of course, as you say, she has remarried, and her new husband is definitely in the picture. And it's a very sort of messy, very grown-up situation. I won't say it's devoid of sentimentality, but the sentimentality is, as you say, bracketed by a lot of realism. And it's really quite remarkable.
Well, it's, it has to be hard-boiled because they've messed up their lives. I think what's important about having the child in the story is that both of them recognize that this is the only way out. This is the only hopeful way out. They are never going to clean up the mess they created for themselves, but that's no reason that the child has to suffer for it. So now you take a deep breath, you suck it up, you are realistic, you go on with things. You make the compromises and the bargains that you're going to have to make with this lawyer who can arrange various things for you. You take all of those decisions on behalf of something that can still be saved or salvaged. He believes that the marriage itself can be salvaged. I'm not so sure that she believes that. But what he's going to encounter is just increasing levels of complications having to deal with this. I think, when you said it often is told just by a line of dialogue or a glance, etc., is wonderful for me to hear, because in a sense, technically, the way I really conceive these books in my head is that they are, I think I've said before, they're movies in my head, and I'm the director as well as the set designer, etc., etc. But what I find that I have to be very careful about is that often when I'm writing the scenes, and my books tend to be very dialogue heavy, their dialogue carries them, because I think dialogue is character. Once the character opens his mouth, you begin to see who he actually is. Somebody who just gives me a physical description gives me nothing. What does it mean that he has a broad nose and a high forehead? So what? It's only when you speak that you reveal yourself. And I have this tendency, as I'm writing, to put down the line, she looked at him, or he looked at her. And what I'm doing is I'm being the camera, and I'm registering the kind of pause and glance that would imply everything that's being said. And I thought, you can't do this in a book. You can't have a scene where he looks at her, she looks at him, he looks at her. You can do it in the movies. You can do it by using the faces. But in a book, you need the dialogue. So I have to keep a sharp eye out for that. And that's a lesson for you as we work on the next book. Always be careful I don't do it too often.
You are so good at dialogue that you need no advice about that. And as you were talking about this, I was thinking about Martin's remembrance of the first lines of dialogue with Sabine. Is that how you pronounce it, Sabine?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the very first lines of dialogue, they're at a party, they're both young, and he is recalling the dialogue between them, which is playful and flirtatious and oblique and erotic. It's very complicated dialogue, and it's funny that the glancedness, is that a word? Glancedness of the dialogue then carries all the way through the whole story, and really is the way that people say and don't say things to each other when they're very important too.
That's in a way the hardest thing to do, the stuff that people don't say, because how do you get that across without saying it? So you have to make some choices along the way. But I delight in writing those kind of scenes. I mean, they're very difficult. They're tricky. There's a scene, we're not going to do any spoilers, but there's a scene where, let's say, a flight is being proposed. And I think I did it several times. It was just a really tough thing to do, because her reaction, I mean, what we're expecting is that somebody comes and says, I'm going to save you, and I'm going to save us all, and I'm going to be the hero of the day. And she's saying, it's not that easy. It's not, we can't do that so quickly. We have lives here. What are you talking about? You just don't make a spy swap and come across the wall and all of a sudden decide to reorder our lives. I've made my own life here, and I'm stuck with it, etc. I think these are all, as you say, grown-up matters, and it's a book for grown-ups. I once wrote a book, and a friend of mine said, you have managed to write a book in which every single one of your characters I'm not sympathetic to. And I said, really? I love them. I don't see what your problem is.
Well, while there are absolutely central important characters to this book, it is a bit of an ensemble presentation, because you have quote unquote secondary characters who are very vivid and through whom the plot absolutely turns. And it's very important that we get to know these characters too, and we do. And if you sort of take a step back, one can see that you have really peopled your story with a remarkable array of characters, even from just the drivers of cars to scientists and all sorts of people, Russians, East Germans, Brits, Americans. It's quite remarkable.
It's rich material. This doesn't come out of nowhere, and I didn't pull it out of the Ethernet. This was an extraordinary time in recent history. And I'm interested in how history affects everybody. We don't choose our times, and we are not necessarily the driver of this bus that we're on. We're often being driven, and often by a madman. What happens when your society is taken over by gangsters or by ideologues or crazies? And how do you deal with that? Do you just curl up into a shell and go into some apartment on Karl Marx Alley and pretend that nothing's going on around you, etc.? Or do you go into the streets? I mean, how do you live? And I think this notion of how we live under the kind of society structures that we form is really central to our own time. I mean, I suppose every time can say that, but this is ours. This is the one we're living through. And I think that, books are looking to examine that all the time. In the same way that on the more personal level, I think that the role of all writing that has any pretension to seriousness is to promote some kind of empathy, to really try to understand somebody else. I think that in a way, we're the ultimate mysteries. Who are we? How well do you know yourself? But really, how well do you know anyone else? You remain a mystery to you, I think. And even in the marriage that we were talking about, there's an intimacy that passes any other kind of intimacy. I mean, the love that they had for each other and the sex that they have with each other, etc., is as close as people can come. And yet, do they know each other? What is one likely to expect? What is one going to do? I think that's what books are about, what writing. You're trying to understand other people, and if you can put somebody in somebody else's shoes, you've really accomplished something. I mean, it's what you hope to do anyway.
Well, I think you're exactly right, and one of the things that happens is in our studying these characters, we of course recognize our own experience in what's going on with them, and it's a trick of the mind that you pull off beautifully, such that even though we are reading a book about these characters and we're involved in their intrigue, somehow emotionally we're implicated in what's going on between them, and that is really satisfying.
Well, that's what I hope. So I hope you're right. That's really the idea.
Let's go back to what you just said about the East Germans or East Berliners under the regime. Did you have any opportunity to talk to people who remembered that period, or did you actually meet anybody that could speak English well enough? I can't remember if you speak German, but
No.
talk about it.
No, I can do Autobahn German and I can read a menu, but that's about it. I mean, I can't do any serious research in German. I do have friends who, well, certainly there's the person who was the child actor, etc. But on the whole, and this is true for all three of the books, and indeed most of my books, the research aside from the location scouting that we talked about and soaking up a city and soaking up local color, as they used to call it, is almost entirely from print and not necessarily through interviews. The first book that I did, Los Alamos, of course, everyone spoke English. And it turned out that later I might have had access to some of the scientists who were actually there at the time. And when I found this out, I was glad in a way that I hadn't known it before, because there's something tricky about interviewing people. They have an authenticity because they were there, but no one actually remembers accurately. And everyone has a different, if you have a dinner party and there are 6 to 8 people there, and 3 weeks later you ask different people how was it, you're going to get 6 to 8 different versions of this, and one can be contradicting the other, etc. I find that what's really useful are things like journalism written at the time because of the assumptions that the pieces are making, letters, diaries, anything which actually is in print, but is in print from that period as opposed to looking back on it, is really valuable because they're giving away premises. You know, this now we look and see, oh, look at the way they were treating women. But for instance, people weren't necessarily thinking that in 1945. So if you read what they actually are saying, then it's a much interesting way in to the insight. I think everybody imagines that what this process is like is that you go into some archive and, you know, that I go to the Stasi headquarters and I read all of the ripped up files and see this. Well, luckily somebody else is doing it for me and then translating it so I can do it just from print. And I don't have to use microfiche machines, which years ago one did, and they were always breaking and snapping. It's not like that. I think that it's much more about the literature that exists, of which, in this particular instance, if we're talking about Berlin and the Holocaust and the Cold War, there's a lot of it. And there's a lot of information around, much of it translated into English if it originated in German. So it's what I call bibliography hopping. You hop from one to the next, and all of a sudden there's a title that comes up that you hadn't seen in the bibliographies before, and you go, why not? What's this one about? So you get into it. It's, for me, the fun part of the whole process. I love the research. It's my wife once said to me, it's like you've taken a graduate course, and you know it's something you know a little bit about, but you want to know more, and so you're taking German 101, you know, and doing this. And I think that's largely true. That I loved being a student, and in a way, you continue being a student if you care about these things. And there are surprises. There are things you don't know. I didn't know, for instance. I mean, I knew that what I wanted to get at about East Berlin and East Germany in general was how ultimately corrupting this kind of state is. I mean, if you are always living a lie, if you are living public lies, if there is no base standard for what is actually true, what is concretely true, but you live in this Orwellian situation where war is peace and peace is war, etc., what does that do to you? I mean, I think this is a question that was very much on our minds while I was writing this book, because in the last few years we've had unfortunate examples of this happening. Well, East Germany is a place where it happens all the time. And I then come across what I had not known about before, but seems to me a stunning kind of example of this, of the complicity of people in this society and how corrupting it ultimately becomes. The Berlin Exchange begins with an exchange of spies, but there are several other exchanges in the book, including in the marriage, with various moral compromises that are made with crime. But behind all of them also is a program that came up in that was started in the 60s, in which, for hard currency, East Germany would release political prisoners. Often these were people who had just tried to escape over the wall, and that constituted a political crime, and therefore you're in jail. And the West Germans were buying them back, were buying them out of prison. This struck me as an extraordinary event. If you're buying and selling people, with the moral ambiguity on both sides this represents, I mean, the East Germans are selling people because they need the hard currency. They're not recognized. The West Germans have the money, but why should they let their fellow citizens, because all Germans are considered, West Germany considered all Germans German citizens. How can you let your fellow citizens languish unfairly in these prisons and have their lives rotting away if it's just a question of money you can afford? But how do you present that to the public? How do you tell people we're buying your cousin out? It was one of these sort of open secrets. It was not much discussed at the time and has been discussed even less since. But when I came across it, it struck me as something that wasn't just interesting in itself, but a great metaphor for what was going on. That people were just commodities in service to this ideological frenzy that was going on and ultimately came undone.
Why do you think that this program has been more or less buried by history? Why have we not heard more about it?
It's hard to say. I think it was in nobody's big interest to make much of it because nobody comes out of this looking wonderful. I mean, I would say that if I had been a West German official, would I have participated in it? Yes. But would I have felt good about that? I mean, it began by money laundering. They would launder this money by offering goods in kind, things that the East Germans needed that they would have to go to the open market to buy. And they just didn't have the dollars or the Deutschmarks to do it. So they were being repaid in fertilizer and chemicals and medicines and things of that sort. Later, it became much more about the money. And the lawyer who, in fact, appears in Bridge of Spies as the man who brokered the spy deals was heavily involved in all of this and made it part of his life's work. It turned out that the average price for a prisoner was the equivalent of $10,000 in Deutschmarks. But that depended, it was always negotiated. It depended on the length of prison term, how valuable this person was to society, whether it was a worker or a professional. And the East German attitude to this was, look, if you're a doctor, we've made you a doctor. We paid for this for years and years and years. And now you just want to get on the subway and go to West Berlin and leave us. And the investment in your career, the investment in this country that we were making on your behalf is totally lost to us. If they want you so much, they're going to have to pay for it. And we want to be reimbursed for this. Now, it's a kind of sleazy way around what was blatantly, we are offering people for money. And other people are saying, fine, we're in the market, we'll buy them, let's negotiate. It's an extraordinary situation.
Yes, and it's basically ransoming one's own citizens.
Yeah.
In books of espionage, there is not a great distance between representations of spycraft that are overwrought or hackneyed or in some way expectable, and on the other hand, representations that are subtle and sly and seem organically authentic to the circumstances. And I have to say, as your editor, I was very alert to the moments when Joe Kanon became a spy on his own behalf. I was very interested in the moments when somebody did something that involved spycraft, whether it was just walking on a street, seeing surveillance, and so forth. And of course, I'm enormously curious about how that came about in your own rendering of those moments. Did you see these things happen? Did you step along the street in a certain hour and look at the lamplight? How did that take place? Because readers love this kind of stuff, and yet it has to be done really well, and you do it well.
Well, Colin, this is a version of a question frequently asked and always asked when I do an event in DC, where someone says, were you yourself employed by one of the intelligence agencies? And I go, no, I've never been recruited. I've never done any of that work. And then invariably someone says, but of course you'd say that. And I'd say, yes, I would. So I have never been a spook. I think what's happened is that we're all involved in this feedback loop. There has been so much writing, and including memoirs, about espionage work and trade. You know, we all know about drops and how you switch bags at airports and those kind of things because we've seen them in the movies. And the movies took them from other books, and the books came sometimes from people who had worked for the CIA, but often people who were just reading other books. So we may now find ourselves in this endless loop of real spies copying what fictional spies have been doing, which was copying real spies, etc. At least that's as close as I come to this. I never walked down Unter den Linden and saw people pass a newspaper to each other and thought, aha, you know, this is a spy. I'm incurious in that way. But one of the reasons that I want to keep this period for my work is that I think that a lot of spycraft now and a lot of espionage is just purely high tech, and everything is known. I mean, when people talk about cyber warfare and hackers, I just throw up my hands and say, I can't wait to read about it. I haven't the faintest clue how that's done. Are there really these people in a basement? It's Lubyanka who are at their computers saying, ooh, we can break into JP Morgan. Let's do it. I mean, I don't know how they do it.
Well, how you do it is very intriguing and satisfying. And, you know, it occurs to me that we might want to offer some folks some chance to ask you some questions, not just listen to my questions. So perhaps there are some questions in your audience here.
Hello. Actually, we have a quiet crowd. I think the talk has been so fascinating. People have just been sitting back and watching. So I've asked if there are questions out there, and there are not. That being said, every time I come back on to do questions, I like to take a second for our guest moderator to kind of talk about their own work. And obviously you are editor-in-chief at Scribner, but you are also an author. Can you tell us either about your latest book or what you're working on, what we can look for from you?
You know, I'll be very brief because this is Joe's night and not mine. I've written some books about New York City, books of intrigue, often involving men and women and crime and power and class. And I think my question to Joe reflects some of those interests. And I confess, I was reading his pages not just as his editor, not just as a reader, but also as a fellow writer, just to see how the heck he does what he does.
Yeah.
Well, and vice versa. I mean, I think, the important thing, people often think they're reading for plot, but I think something has to be going on the page. And I think how things are written and the way in which things are presented is really crucial, and certainly to things that I enjoy.
Okay, well, on that note, I'm not going to keep us here any longer. I thought it was a fascinating conversation, and I have the link in the comments for those of you who want more information about Berlin Exchange. As I said, we're all big fans of Joe's at Murder by the Book, so he is consistently such a wonderful author that we always highly recommend him. His backlist, you can't go wrong with his books. So for those of you watching, if you'd like more information or you'd like to order, the link is in the comments. Colin, thank you so much for being here tonight and leading such an informed, obviously, conversation. And I wish everyone a good evening. Thanks so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Pleasure.